Imagine a country literally sitting on an ocean of oil, making hundreds of billions of dollars from it. But instead of futuristic skyscrapers, it gets wars, terrorism, dictatorship, and ruined cities. A nation that could have become the next United Arab Emirates, but instead turned into a symbol of chaos in the Middle East. This is the story of Iraq. A country that oil both made rich and destroyed. Hey everyone, welcome to World Gap. Today, we're diving into why one of the most resource-rich countries in the world has been stuck in crisis for decades, how oil turned Iraq into a battlefield for global powers, and why its history still shapes the entire Middle East. Right now, Iraq is one of the biggest oil exporters on the planet. But if you look at the quality of life, the infrastructure, or basic safety, you have to ask, where the hell is all that money going? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. The land that's now Iraq used to be ancient Mesopotamia. This is literally where the first cities, writing, schools, and the foundations of human civilization started. Babylon, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, stood right here. But the country of Iraq itself didn't exist for a very long time. These lands kept getting passed from one empire to another. Persians, Arabs, Mongols, Ottomans. The Ottomans controlled the region for about 300 years. Everything changed after World War I. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and European powers started carving up the Middle East. Britain got control of what would become Iraq, and basically created the country from scratch. They stitched it together like a patchwork. The British combined three very different provinces: Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. Up north lived the Kurds, the largest ethnic group in the world without their own country. They wanted independence. In the center, Sunni Arabs were dominant. In the south, Shiites, who had been clashing with Sunnis for centuries. On top of that, there were Turks, Christians, Jews, and other minorities. So they created a country where tons of people hated each other, but were forced to live together. And all of this was happening on top of massive oil reserves. In the early 20th century, oil suddenly became the most important resource on Earth. World War I proved that the future of warfare would depend on fuel. Tanks, planes, trucks, everything ran on oil. The British quickly realized, whoever controls Middle Eastern oil controls the future. That's why Iraq's independence was mostly just on paper. British military bases stayed in the country, and Western companies completely controlled the oil industry. Iraq pumped the oil, but most of the money went to foreigners. Companies like BP, Shell, and others basically had a monopoly on the fields. Only small royalty payments made it into the Iraqi budget. Basically, the country existed as a raw material appendage, and that became the foundation for all the problems that followed. On one side, deep internal conflicts between Kurds, Sunnis, and Shiites. On the other, constant meddling by outside powers who wanted to control the oil. Eventually, people got fed up. In 1968, the Ba'ath Party came to power, and one of its key figures was Saddam Hussein. A few years later, he nationalized the oil industry and took control of the resources away from foreigners. For the West, this was a massive blow. At first, things actually looked pretty promising. With oil money pouring in, Iraq started developing fast. Roads, factories, schools, and hospitals were built. Education and healthcare became free. Living standards were rising. But another problem quickly appeared. How do you keep a country together when several big groups hate each other and all the money comes from just one source? Saddam chose the simplest solution: brutal dictatorship. He understood that if he loosened control, Iraq could fall apart. The Kurds would push for independence. The Shiites would fight for power. The Sunnis wouldn't want to lose their influence. The distribution of oil made it especially dangerous. The biggest oil fields were in Kurdish territory in the north and Shiite territory in the south, but the most important pipelines ran through Sunni areas. If the country split, a war over resources would break out. So Saddam's regime was built on fear, the army, and total control. But there was another problem: foreign countries. After nationalizing oil, a lot of major players were furious. Iraq no longer wanted to be dependent on the West. Something similar had already happened in neighboring Iran. Their prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, also tried to nationalize oil. 2 years later, he was overthrown with help from the CIA and British intelligence. Saddam knew this risk very well, so he strengthened the dictatorship at home while trying to play the superpowers against each other. It's interesting that at different times, both the USSR and the United States supported him. In the 1970s, Iraq bought huge amounts of weapons from the Soviet Union. But at the same time, it cooperated with the Americans. Washington happily gave loans so Baghdad could buy Western weapons. Today, a lot of people see Hussein as America's eternal enemy. But the reality was much more complicated. When it suited them, the West was perfectly fine working with his regime, even despite the brutal repression. For example, during the campaign against the Kurds in northern Iraq, the government used chemical weapons. Thousands died or were forced to flee their homes. But back then, the world powers preferred to look the other way, because an even worse war was coming. By the late 1970s, something happened in the Middle East that completely changed the balance of power. In Iran, the Islamic Revolution broke out. The pro-American Shah was overthrown, and Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. For the United States, this was a nightmare scenario. They were losing one of their biggest allies in the region, but Saddam Hussein got even more scared. The problem was that the majority of Iraq's population are Shiites. Saddam himself was from the Sunni minority. He was terrified that the revolutionary ideas from Iran would spill over into his own country. The tension quickly turned into war. Iraq's plan was simple: launch a lightning strike, seize the oil-rich Iranian province of Khuzestan, take control of the resources, and boost its own power in the region. Saddam expected an easy victory in just a few days. Instead, what followed was one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years. In that time, both countries lost around 1 million people. Their economies were wrecked, cities were turned into ruins, and oil money was burned up in endless fighting. Meanwhile, the world powers were happily making money off the conflict. The USSR sold weapons to Iraq. The US officially supported Baghdad because they didn't want Iran to get stronger after the Islamic Revolution. But later it came out that the Americans were secretly selling weapons to Iran too. That scandal became known as the Iran-Contra affair. The logic of the superpowers was pretty cynical. As long as Iran and Iraq were busy destroying each other, neither one could become too powerful. Former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger perfectly captured it when he said, "It's a pity. They can't both lose." In the end, the region was flooded with weapons, debt, and hatred, and Iraq came out of the war basically bankrupt. The economy was destroyed. Oil prices were falling. They had a massive army to feed. Debts were piling up. That's when Saddam decided to try another quick little victorious war. This time, the target was Kuwait. Hussein accused his neighbors of flooding the market and crashing oil prices by pumping too much. But that wasn't the whole story. Kuwait was a tiny country sitting on enormous oil reserves. If Iraq took it, Saddam would suddenly control a huge chunk of the global oil market. The international situation looked favorable. The Soviet Union was collapsing. Europe was distracted with its own problems, and the US was still avoiding big wars after Vietnam. In August 1990, the Iraqi army invaded Kuwait and captured the whole country in just 2 days. But Saddam miscalculated badly. The United States realized if Iraq stayed in Kuwait, it would control a massive portion of the world's oil reserves. That was unacceptable for Washington, and that's how Operation Desert Storm began. Officially, it was an international coalition of dozens of countries against Iraq. But the real force was the American military. At the time, Iraq had one of the largest and most powerful armies in the world. Huge numbers of tanks, aircraft, and soldiers. But against modern US technology, it wasn't enough. In just a few weeks, Saddam's army was crushed. Kuwait was liberated. Thousands of Iraqi vehicles were destroyed, and Iraq was hit with heavy sanctions. But here's the interesting part. They didn't remove Saddam. Even though the Americans could have marched on Baghdad in 1991, they chose not to. Why? Because as brutal as his regime was, it was actually convenient for many players. Iraq kept selling oil. International companies kept making money. And Saddam remained the perfect, big bad guy of the region. Everything changed after September 11th, 2001. The attacks in New York and Washington shocked America. US leaders needed to show strength and hit back. The problem was that the actual organizers were in Afghanistan. Fighting in the mountains against terrorist groups was messy and difficult. But there was Saddam Hussein, a dictator with a terrible reputation who had already been demonized by the media for years. The administration of George W. Bush started claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and might give them to terrorists. They showed little vials at the UN and talked about secret labs. Later it turned out there was almost no real evidence. No serious links to 9/11 and no working WMDs were ever found. But the invasion was already underway. In 2003, the US military quickly took over Iraq. Saddam's regime collapsed in just a few weeks. Statues of the dictator were torn down, and Saddam himself was later found hiding in a hole in the ground. It looked like the US had won an easy victory. President Bush even declared, "Mission accomplished." In reality, it was just the beginning. The Americans made a huge mistake, whose consequences the Middle East is still dealing with today. The first thing the new authorities did was completely disband the Iraqi army. Hundreds of thousands of professional soldiers were suddenly left without jobs, without money, and without any future. People with tons of combat experience were thrown out onto the street. Many of those former officers and soldiers later became the core of the most dangerous terrorist groups in the region. First came Al-Qaeda in Iraq, then the Islamic State of Iraq, and eventually ISIS. After the Americans left, the terrorists rapidly seized huge territories in Iraq and Syria. They took over cities, oil fields, and millions of people. The world got one of the most brutal organizations of the 21st century. And a big part of its rise was a direct result of the 2003 invasion. When ISIS started capturing city after city, it became clear, after Saddam was overthrown, Iraq didn't become more stable. Just the opposite. The country completely fell into chaos. The militants quickly took control of huge territories, areas the size of entire European countries. The Iraqi army that America had spent almost 10 years rebuilding simply ran away in some places. Terrorists seized weapons depots, oil fields, money, and whole cities with almost no resistance. At one point, it looked like Baghdad itself might fall. To stop the disaster, the US had to come back to the region and put together yet another international coalition. It was almost absurd. The Americans first destroyed the old power structure in Iraq, then spent years fighting the consequences of their own invasion. But the main question remains the same. Why does Iraq keep ending up at the center of global conflicts? The answer is still the same: oil. If you took away the oil money, the country would probably turn into something like Somalia or Afghanistan. Endless war of everyone against everyone. Oil is the only thing still holding Iraq back from total collapse. The problem is that oil money has been both a blessing and a curse. Instead of building a strong economy, developing industry, and technology, the country has lived for decades, almost entirely off selling raw resources. And wherever there's easy money in huge amounts, corruption almost always follows. A few years ago, Iraq was rocked by a massive scandal. Billions of dollars disappeared from the state treasury through fake companies. And that was just one episode in a long history of corruption. At the same time, most of the population still lives nowhere near as well as you'd expect in an oil superpower. Many cities suffer from destroyed infrastructure, constant power outages, and high unemployment. Iraq is trapped. On one hand, Kurds, Sunnis, and Shiites still have too many deep conflicts. On the other, splitting the country could trigger an even bigger war over the oil fields and pipelines. The north is rich in oil. The south is rich in oil. Export routes run through different territories. Every region depends on the others. That's exactly why Iraq still exists as one country, despite all the internal conflicts. Outside players want it this way too. Saudi Arabia doesn't want a huge ruined territory full of dozens of armed groups right next door. Iran also doesn't want its neighbor to completely fall apart. The consequences would be too dangerous. Even the world powers who keep interfering in Iraq understand. A total collapse could blow up the entire Middle East. So they support Iraq just enough to keep it from falling apart completely, but not enough for it to become truly strong. Saddam Hussein's story is especially telling here. In the early years of his rule, he actually carried out real reforms. Schools and hospitals were built, industry grew, infrastructure developed. For many Iraqis, that period felt like stability. But then wars, dictatorship, and the fight for influence swallowed everything. Huge oil revenues started going not to development, but to the army, weapons, and endless conflicts. Iraq tried to become the main player in the region, but ended up as an arena for everyone else's interests. In recent decades, practically everyone has fought here. The US, Iran, terrorist groups, international coalitions, mercenaries, and all kinds of armed factions. And it all revolves around one resource. Oil made Iraq incredibly important to the whole world, but it's also exactly what turned the country into a permanent battleground. Because control over oil isn't just about money. It's about influence on the global economy, fuel prices, and the politics of entire nations. In essence, Iraq ended up in a situation where too many players benefit from its weakness. A strong, independent Iraq with massive oil reserves could have become a regional superpower and set its own rules. But history shows that as soon as the country tried to play too big a role, wars, sanctions, or outside pressure immediately followed. And that might be the main paradox of Iraq. The country has everything it needs to be incredibly wealthy. Resources, great location, and huge potential. But those same advantages have turned it into a battlefield for decades. The story of Iraq is a perfect example of how natural riches don't always make a nation successful. Sometimes they become the reason for endless instability. And as long as oil remains one of the planet's most important resources, the struggle for influence in Iraq is unlikely to ever fully end. If you enjoyed the video, hit like and subscribe to World Gap. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think Iraq's history could have turned out differently, or was the oil curse inevitable? See you in the next video.